This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I am Gilad Halpern.
And I'm Dahlia Shenlin. I'm your co-host together with Gilad. And we'll be talking every week about books and ideas and other things that have caught our attention. Our guest today is the author, novelist, and journalist Adam LeBor. As a foreign correspondent, he covered the collapse of communism and the Yugoslavian wars for The Independent and The Times and has worked in more than 30 countries. He currently reports from Hungary and Central Europe for The Economist, Monocle Magazine, and Newsweek. In the United States, he contributes to The New York Times and The Daily Beast. He is insanely prolific, having written 8 nonfiction books, including City of Oranges, Arabs and Jews in Jaffa. But he covers a range of topics about international affairs, international conflict, global finance systems, World War II, the Nazis, and of course, the famous biography of Slobodan Milosevic. And all that is before mentioning his fiction, which is actually what we're going to be talking about today, the Yael Azoulay series of spy thrillers. This past November, he published the third in the series, called The Reykjavik Assignment, which joins the first 2 books, The Washington Stratagem and The Geneva Option. Adam LeBor, thank you for being on the show.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. Let's start with the series. Tell us about the heroine, Yael Azoulay. Who is she? She's based on Yael from the Book of Judges, is that right?
Yes, I think the origins of Yael Azoulay go right back to when I was at school, when we read the Book of Deborah at the Jewish Free School in London. And I was very impressed with the story of Yael. I don't know if you remember that story, but I'll recount it for your listeners anyway, that there was a huge battle between the Hebrews and the Canaanites, and the Canaanite general went off to hide somewhere, and she took him in, pretending to offer him sanctuary. While he was asleep, she drove a tent peg through his head and then presented him to the next passing Hebrew who was looking for him. And I thought, that's really a scary story. There's some really dangerous girls out there.
So that's what Yael Azoulay does in
She
the
doesn't
novels
do
as
that,
well.
but it somehow made a big impression on me, and it really put me off going on the school camping trip as well.
But I also see her in a way, I'm not sure if you're going to agree with my characterization, but sort of a reverse Robin Hood of conflict. In other words, she sort of makes these nasty and lucrative deals with terrible villains, but in return for them agreeing to head off war and atrocities and trying to actually save lives, she's trying to do good in some way, even maybe mete out judgment. And of course, the Daily Mail called her the Israeli female James Bond. So which is the better characterization?
Well, I think it's a bit of both. I mean, what interested me about Yael was people who operate in the grey area of ambiguity. I got very interested in the United Nations when I was covering the Yugoslav wars. And her job is to be the secret envoy for the Secretary General of the United Nations, to do all the dirty deals behind the scenes that really keep superpower diplomacy moving and keep the corporations in business for, on balance, doing good. You know, she lets the bad guys go free sometimes, but to stop a new war happening. So I was very interested in this kind of moral equation of when is it justified to do something, when is it not justified to do something. And that grew out of my experiences in the Bosnian War, where I spent a lot of time with UN peacekeepers. And you could argue it either way. What was the UN doing in Sarajevo? For the Bosnians, it was running the siege because the UN troops encircled the airport. Only UN planes could go in and out, and they weren't allowed on them. If they tried to get to the airport or tried to leave the city, UN troops would stop them. But for the UN was keeping the city alive because it was the UN airlift in the UN-controlled airport that was bringing in food, supplies and medicines. Without that, a lot more people should have died. So you can argue it either way. And I thought that was very interesting. And that's the real world. That's how the world works or doesn't work.
So is she based on someone that you've encountered in your, many adventures around the world? One person or several people that you rolled into one?
She's based on several people, I guess, rolled into one. No, there's no single person. As far as I know, her job doesn't really exist in real life, but
and doesn't exist for real in the novels either, because it's not supposed to exist, right?
Yeah, exactly. She's not even really supposed to be on the books. She's operating off the books, but she's based on various women that I've met that impressed me.
But would you also say that you maybe wish somebody like her existed or somebody like her role?
I think that's a very interesting question. I think it would be good if there was someone who could kind of clearly see what needed to be done outside sometimes the superpowers' needs, because the way diplomacy works in the UN, especially around the Security Council, is everything is around the needs of the superpowers. Russia wants this, China wants that. And the UN officials just go along with it. And sometimes it would be good, and I think it would have been good in real life in the past at the time of Rwanda or Srebrenica, if UN officials had just started shouting and saying, we have to stop this, we have to do something about this, we don't care what America says, we don't care what Moscow says. We are the UN. We need to take a moral stand.
Yeah, someone to clear up the mess. I think this is a fantasy we all have.
Exactly, yes.
Why did you choose a woman as your protagonist? Is there a specific reason?
Yeah, I think it's just much more difficult to write a female protagonist when you're a man, because, to write a protagonist, you have to get into his or her head. And I just thought it would be much more challenging. My first novel, The Budapest Protocol, the protagonist is a foreign correspondent based in Budapest, curiously, whose name is Alex. And a friend of mine said to me, I really liked your book, The Budapest Protocol, Adam, but next time you might want to think of a protagonist who's not a journalist, doesn't live in Budapest, and hasn't got a 4-letter name that begins with A. And I thought, all right, okay, let's try a woman this time. Right. And it's just more challenging. You've got to challenge yourself creatively.
How did you try to put yourself into the figure of a woman of a certain age, who's got this intense professional secret career and all this history and difficult stuff?
Well, I know a lot of women of that age, and I have some idea, I think, of the conflicts that they have between career and family, and what's going on in their head. And I just kind of used my imagination, really, and hoped I was empathetic.
Well, what kind of research did you have to do?
Well, the main research I did was actually a non-fiction book called Complicity with Evil, the United Nations in the Age of Modern Genocide, which was a study of the UN's failures in Bosnia, Rwanda and Darfur. And that's where I got the idea for the fiction series for, because the UN it's a complete snake pit. It really is full of spies. All the different departments are at war with each other, or let's say are often at war with each other. Everyone's competing for influence. Everyone is, looking in the room, who's sitting where, who's up, who's down. And it's all very compressed because it's all in one building. I mean, all organizations are like this, but the UN is 38 floors of this in a nice tower block on the Manhattan shoreline. So it's conveniently situated. And when I was doing that book, lots of people spoke to me, but they would always or often kind of usher me off to little secret alcoves and hidden cafes and places I never knew existed in the building. And it was all, deep background, Adam, don't mention my name. We never met. I was never here. And, but you really ought to know that. And one of them was a friend in one of the departments who spoke to me, and she ushered me out onto a balcony.
The balcony,
the inner balcony in the air shaft of the building on the 38th floor. And she said, we have to meet here. And the balcony was about the size of this table, 2 meters by 3 meters. And it was very interesting. At first, because I don't like heights. I'm quite scared of heights. So I was kind of
You're afraid she was going to throw you off.
I thought, what an interesting place when I could kind of conquer my terror of being so high on a balcony with a low railing in front of me, because you could hear the wind howling up inside the building, and it was filthy because it obviously never been cleaned since it was built. And I just thought, oh my God, all I have to do is just go on her shoulder and over she goes. And that gave me the idea for the opening scene of the Geneva option.
So you channel this into your fiction.
Yeah, absolutely.
But, I want to go back to the UN. Exactly. Talk about using the UN. I mean, the UN really comes out, you're basically, how shall I put this, scathing of the UN in the books. Now, do you, it seems like, you don't believe the UN is capable of balancing the political interests with the peacemaking side of it, or the business and, financial interests.
I wouldn't say that I was
hopeless?
scathing.
Okay.
That's interesting that you see it as scathing. I didn't intend to be scathing. I didn't write the book as some kind of cry of moral outrage. That was the non-fiction book. No, in fiction, I didn't want it to be didactic. I wanted it to kind of show the complexities and the ambiguities and the things that it has to deal with. Yeah, I mean, it does show, craven careerism and corruption and lots of murky business. But not everyone in the book who works for the UN is a hopeless case or a loser. I mean, there are some good and brave people in the book who work for the UN, as there are in real life.
So when you were talking to all these sources that gave you inside information about the UN and all those secret meetings, did it surprise you? Were you taken aback by what they were telling you, or having had the experience of covering the UN, you kind of knew everything?
Or is it basically, did it reflect what you suspected was going on from being on the ground during those failed UN missions?
Yeah, it's more, as Dalia asked, it was very clear that the UN civil servants, the secretariat that they're called, the professional people who work at the UN, just pretty much did what they were told by the superpowers. And I think that is what led to some of these catastrophic failures, because they have options. During Rwanda and during Srebrenica, they could have called an emergency press conference, or they could have demanded a meeting of the Security Council. But there's this sort of passivity all the time that it's up to the superpowers to do it. We can't do anything. Well, I think you can actually do quite a lot. Maybe if you can't do it, you can demand that things be done. You can highlight issues. The Srebrenica massacre took place over several days, and there was a number of opportunities when people could have been shouting and screaming that people are being slaughtered, and we're not doing anything about it.
And in the end, it's almost like the world blamed the Dutch rather than the UN.
Yeah, I mean, that was the Dutch. The Dutch role was, it's still a huge national trauma for the Dutch. I mean, the Dutch would say, what could we do against the Bosnian Serb army, which is a huge army, essentially the Yugoslav army rolling in against us. We were lightly armed, and there weren't any airstrikes to defend us. At the same time, there was a couple of hundred people that took refuge on the actual Dutch UN base, and the Dutch handed them over as well. I didn't even say, okay, you're here, we're going to defend this territory. So it's a pretty catastrophic story.
Well, here we are going back and forth between reality and fiction, which is a lot of what you've done as a journalist and a fiction writer. And I want to ask you how you made that transition, but maybe I'll propose how I read, the work, and see if you agree with me. It seems like you're really giving the readers a lot of information that maybe most average readers of spy thrillers don't have about these situations. I mean, you really explain some of these conflicts, and you get a lot of them in there. I wonder if you, somewhere in the back of your mind, thought this is an era where, foreign affairs isn't that interesting, especially to American audiences. Foreign bureaus are closing, journalism is shrinking, and maybe through fiction, people will understand some of these conflicts and dilemmas.
Yeah, I think that was a part of it. I mean, first of all, I wanted to write a good story that was enthralling with good characters. But obviously, my background as a journalist and writer of non-fiction came in, and that's the framework that I operated in. And I think, in that framework, you can raise issues about what's happening in the world that maybe someone wouldn't read a worthy op-ed in the New York Times, but they can read a thriller. And I've had letters and emails from readers saying, you really made me think about these things, about Rwanda and about the UN and the other things that you talk about. And I think that's great. But you have to be careful, though, because the minute you start getting didactic and lecturing, then the reader can, put it down. So it's story first, but framework of the story can be something new for them.
How difficult was it to make that transition from non-fiction to fiction? Is it a different set of skills?
Yeah, it's really difficult. I mean, it's really, really difficult, because as a journalist, you're trained to explain everything. Who, what, when, where, why, how, 2 quotes, and a bit of background, and there's your story. So in fiction, you have to do completely the opposite, because the first drafts of the Budapest Protocol is a conspiracy thriller, where the hero discovers that the European Union's a front for the Fourth Reich, really, and that the German industrialists run the Second World War and are running the European economy.
Which is also not too far off from one
exactly.
of your other nonfiction books. You want to tell us about that one briefly?
Exactly, I will do. And the early drafts of it was all kind of explained within about 6 pages. And I'm looking at it and thinking, well, where's the adventure here? Where's the conspiracy? Because you're so trained to explain everything. And I would hand my drafts to my wife and she'd say, explaining, and just throw them back at me. And then eventually you realise you don't have to tell people what's going on. You don't have to give everyone's backstory. Just a bit. The worst hazard for journalists writing fiction is what's called info dumping. Is that you just dump all the info about the person's backstory, their biography, the plot, and everything, and then you look at it and you think, oh, okay, what am I going to do now? But you can conquer it, and it's also a well-worn path. I mean, Frederick Forsyth, he used to be a Reuters correspondent. thriller writer. Well, he's not really a thriller writer, kind of a mystery espionage writer I really like called Alan First. He used to be
Of course.
he was a journalist, did some journalism. Ian Fleming dabbled in journalism as well. So what's good about it is that it teaches you to see. You can spot telling details to kind of understand a situation. You meet people and you kind of make a judgment about them, which might be right or might be wrong, but you get a picture of people quite quickly. So there are a lot of kind of observational technical skills.
I think that comes out when you talk about a taxi ride when she's fleeing from some scene, and you talk about the kind of plastic where the driver's information is laminated in the taxi. And I thought I would never have known, what's that material called? It doesn't even matter. But
Perspex.
Yes, well, that's what it is. Let's talk about your characters a little bit. I
Sure.
noticed that a number of the characters are sort of emerged from cross-cultural backgrounds. There's,
Yes.
an imagined Secretary General who is the product of a Muslim and Hindu marriage, and there's this potential, of course, Israeli-Palestinian romance, and a Bosnian fighter in the Syrian opposition. Do you have a fascination with people who come from cross-cultural boundaries?
Yeah, always. Yeah,
Why?
I don't know. I think partly growing up in London, I've just always been in a multicultural, cosmopolitan society, and even when I was at school, I was very interested in Islamic Spain, in the golden age of Jewry under Muslim rule, and I thought, cultural. I'm a really strong believer in cultural fusion. That doesn't mean I think everything should dissolve into some big amorphous mass, but I think if you look at food and literature and music, everything is, swirling into each other, and new things come out of that. I mean, look at the great British dish of fish and chips. I mean, the fish was brought in by Sephardi immigrants. There was no tradition of fried food in Britain, and the chips came from Holland, and that's our national dish.
Let alone curry.
Yeah, let alone chicken tikka masala, which no one in India has ever eaten in their life. It's a completely British construct.
You wrote the 3 novels in the Yael Azoulay series in relatively close proximity over 3 or 4 years, right?
Yes, yeah.
Did it start out as a series? Were you planning for
Oh,
it
absolutely,
to be?
yes, yeah, and partly because publishers want series. They don't. They want to know that the writer is going to produce more books. It doesn't have to be the same character, but it's a simple framework. And I thought it's it's a challenge to write the series because each episode has to stand alone. But also, if someone's read the other episodes, they don't want to be bored thinking, God, I already read all this.
So when you were writing the first novel, you actually wrote the entire series in your head at the same time?
No, I had a rough idea. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I didn't. The second and third are they're sequential episodes, really, because the third one picks up instantly from the end of the second one. The second one ends on a cliffhanger, which some people got quite annoyed about if you read the Amazon reviews.
But isn't that the whole point, to end everything on a cliffhanger so that people want to read the next?
Well, that's the tricky thing. If someone buys a book and it ends on a complete cliffhanger, I kind of understand in a way they feel a bit conned, because there's no resolution. And it takes a year for the next book to come out. So I don't think I'd do that again, but you have to kind of juggle it so there's enough in there to make a satisfying read.
So are people queuing up outside bookshops all over the world now?
All over the world.
Waiting for the
global, everywhere.
Where have you gotten the most responses from? I mean, are your readers, do you have any sense if your readers are mostly Americans, British, or other places?
Well, America and Britain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, because I was wondering about you cover so many conflicts in some depth. Do you get any responses from people who lived through those times as well and say, well, you portrayed us this way or that way, or we would have preferred something
No,
different?
I haven't, actually, no. Mostly from average readers, which is gratifying.
Why did you choose this genre, thrillers?
Because that's what I like reading.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You never thought about writing, I don't know, a love story or any other kind of novel?
No.
Oh, I wish our listeners could see the face you just made.
No, not a love story. But there's love stories in the book.
Yeah.
But I have thought about doing a family saga, actually.
Whose family?
Well,
Yael Azoulay.
Yeah, no, something completely different. But some way down the line.
Well, you do also write about families in your book about Jaffa.
Yes, exactly.
You have a fascination with families.
Yes, yeah.
And why did you choose to write about families in Jaffa? If we can just diverge a little bit.
Sure, yeah. I wanted to tell the story. I wanted to write a book about Israel and Palestine because I spent a lot of time in Israel. I lived on a kibbutz. I studied Arabic at Hebrew University. I have family here.
And you speak Hebrew as well.
Some Hebrew, and some Arabic. And I thought, after the Milosevic book, I could see that was a good way to tell the story of Yugoslavia through his life. But obviously there's no one life that can encapsulate Israel and Palestine. And I wanted to do something more ambitious as well. So I was speaking to my editor, to my publisher, and I said, let's find 3 families, 3 Jewish families and 3 Arab families all in one place, and kind of try and tell the story of Israel and Palestine through their lives. And it was quite tricky to do. I mean, obviously we could have done it in Haifa, but Haifa doesn't have great name recognition. No disrespect to Haifa, it's a beautiful place, but more people have heard of Jaffa, I think. And Jerusalem, there's so many books about Jerusalem. I didn't want to really get into Jerusalem. And I also thought it was really interesting how Tel Aviv grew out of Jaffa. I think most people, probably in Israel, they know that, but outside Israel, most people don't know that Tel Aviv started as a suburb of Jaffa. The families like the Shlush family they were in Jaffa, and then they funded the Neve Tzedek and all those places now, and it's just an amazing story.
I mean, I assume that you were going to write a fiction, a novel about Israel-Palestine one of these days. Am I wrong to assume that?
I could do that, yeah. I've got lots of ideas.
You heard it
bubbling.
here first, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah, I've got lots of ideas bubbling, yeah.
Does the fact that Yael Azoulay is an Israeli add a lot to her character, to the story?
Yes, yeah, because she's used to work for the Mossad, and she can't escape them.
Can anybody?
They're after her.
Yeah, but
and her ex-boyfriend is after her.
Did it ever cross your mind to give her another nationality or another kind of...
No.
In other words, the most impressive women that you've met have been Israeli. That's what you're trying to say.
1 or 2 of them have been. Yeah, 1 or 2 of them. Yeah, definitely. There was 1 or 2 that helped inspire her. But as soon as you bring that element in, it just makes for a better thriller, because everyone immediately makes all these associations. And I didn't want to write about CIA or MI6 or.
Why not?
Because I think it's been done, quite a lot, and I just thought, that's quirky. An Israeli ex-Mossad agent working for the UN. As a friend of mine said to me, I see the idea in fiction that you've got a high-ranking Israeli being a very senior UN official, but what she's doing is more like science fiction. So,
how did you? Choose the name, Yael Azoulay?
Well, Yael...
from the Bible.
From the Bible.
No, Yael, but why Azoulay?
I just wanted to give her... I don't know, I always like that name somehow. Mm-hmm. When I told you I had this fascination with Islamic Spain, and Jewish life in Spain, and it's a classic kind of name from that era. So...
Maybe if I can just go back to the UN thing for 1 minute, I guess we're probably wrapping up. But, again... You say you weren't trying to be scathing, but there's a lot of critique in there, and it's fair critique. And maybe let's focus on the conflict, the internal conflicts that you talked about between, those different special interests, business, politics, and peacemaking. Do you think the UN is ultimately a salvageable institution if it would, address those conflicts head on and work to improve them?
Yeah, I think it is, absolutely. And firstly, I wanted to add also that the UNHCR, who deal with refugees, do really good work. There's a split between the people that are dealing with superpower politics and people on the ground saving lives. So it's important to recognise, the World Food Programme, the UNHCR, the work they do in health and development and in crises. They're the first in with the blue flag and the bales of food and supplies. So that part is working. But what I would like to see is stronger kind of moral leadership on the political side. I mean, for example, I thought Ban Ki-moon was pretty weak on Syria, really, when you consider what was happening in Syria.
Right. And just to bring it back to a local context, in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Israeli government is constantly accusing the UN either of political bias when it does try to take moral leadership, or else being actively exploited by Hamas and terrorist organizations sort of using their facilities. I mean, maybe it's a no-win situation for the UN.
Well, on something like Israel and Palestine, I think you could say it's almost a no-win situation, because it's very clear that on the UN Human Rights Council, for example, I mean, they're obsessed with Israel and Palestine. There's dozens of resolutions all the time about Israel and Palestine, and very little attention is paid, for example, to South Sudan, which is a major humanitarian crisis, or Syria.
Bordering on genocide, we should say.
Yeah, or Syria. That's a catastrophe, what's happening there. And so I think it's very fair to ask what is the priorities of these parts of the UN. That's why we have to be careful talking about, the UN as a whole, because it's not a homogenous block. There's different parts. As I said, UNHCR, World Food Programme, doing good work. UN Human Rights Council, over focusing on Israel and Palestine at the extent of much worse conflicts. UN Secretariat dealing with the P5, Britain, France, America, China, Russia, the permanent five, too concerned to meet the needs of the superpowers.
Were you drawn in any way into the Israel debate in the English-speaking world, having Israeli protagonists, some people, Israeli critics saying that you're maybe idealizing Israel and other pro-Israel activists saying that you're too critical, or was it just taken at face value as a fiction?
Not yet. No, but I wouldn't mind that. I mean, the more people talking about my books, the better. Yeah, I mean, bring on some debate.
Are there prospects of a, television or film rendition?
We have continual flare-ups of film and TV interest, and I'm actually speaking to a company now. But any producers listening, rights are available.
All the many producers listening right now. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Rights are available, and we're open to offers. But yeah, we have continual interest. I think also the amazing TV series that are coming out of Israel, like Fauda and Keshet is now a big player on the international TV scene, has made an Israeli connection quite helpful, actually.
Right.
All right, Adam LeBor, whose book, The Reykjavik Assignment, is the third in the Yael Azoulay spy thriller series, came out last year. We should all read that, as well as the other two installments. And there's also an ebook, right?
There's an ebook called The Istanbul Exchange, and that's published by HarperCollins, as the books are all published in America by HarperCollins. That's free for American readers, or I shouldn't say anyone with an American IP address. And in English,
you can tell he's a spy thriller.
Yeah, exactly.
If you're not,
you're giving away all the tips.
Otherwise, you can get it from Head of Zeus, which is the British publishers, and that's 99 pence. So I think it's worth a bunch.
And I'm also going to make a push for your nonfiction as well, because there is some interesting overlap, and B, it's such a wide range of interesting topics that are of significant importance for anybody who's interested in global affairs. And with all that, I'll say also a big thanks to Tammy Goldenberg, our sound engineer, and to the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. If you like this podcast, there are many more where it came from. Just go to www.tlv1.fm/podcasts and take your pick, but actually listen to every single one of them. Don't forget to visit our new website, telavivreview.org, like us on Facebook, and follow us on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review, and until then, goodbye.